right, everybody, let's get started. Good morning, and welcome to the South Atlantic LCC's third Thursday Web Forum. My name's Hillary Morris. I work on Blueprint User Support and Communications for your Cooperative. So this is a monthly event. Every month, third Thursday at 10 a.m., your Cooperative hosts a web forum featuring a presentation on current and ongoing work throughout the South Atlantic LCC. And it's really a great chance for anyone who's interested to ask questions and provide input that will help guide the future of your Cooperative. So every forum has basically the same agenda. I'll start out with some introductions. Our presenter will then speak for 30 to 40 minutes. And following the presentation, the floor is really open to ask any questions about the presentation. We'll spend the rest of the time on updates from your Cooperative and wrap up with an open discussion where anyone can ask questions about what your Cooperative is up to. So before I hand things off to Brad, a few logistics. Most of you are probably already on mute, but I am hearing some background noise, so I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone during the presentation. So if you have any questions, you can either type them directly into the chat box, and I'll monitor that, or you can hold them until after the presentation. So if you do use the chat box and you want everyone to be able to read the question during the discussion, just remember to send the note to everyone rather than a private message. And to speak at any time, all you need to do is press *6 to unmute yourself. So before I mute everybody, does anyone want to chime in with questions?
The conference is now in silent mode.
Great. So today we have Bradley Pickens presenting. He's a Postdoctoral Research Associate with both the North Carolina Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit at NC State, as well as the South Atlantic LCC. So he'll be talking about modeling restoration sites for one of the bird species in your Cooperative's Pine Bird Index, the Bachman Sparrow. So Brad, it looks like you've got presenter power, so you can go ahead and get us started.
Okay, great. Thank you, Hillary. Can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
All right, excellent. So first off, I want to thank my co-authors on this particular part of my project with the South Atlantic LCC. Jeff Marcus from the Nature Conservancy, Paul Talley from NC State, John Carpenter, Scott Anderson from the Wildlife Resources Commission, as well as Jaime Colazo. Everyone here has been really instrumental in getting feedback from the modeling we've done here, and really Jeff kind of got this started with helping share some of the data that the Wildlife Resources Commission had and really got things going. So I thank them all very much for their assistance with this. If you are not familiar with the South Atlantic Landscape Conservation Cooperative, our mission here is to create a shared blueprint for landscape conservation actions that sustain natural cultural resources, and you can see our geography there. So, as hopefully you are aware, we have Conservation Blueprint 2.0, which basically is a map, as you see there, that has priorities. So you see the highest priority in the darkest color, followed by high priority corridors and a medium priority. So basically what this is a map that prioritizes ecological integrity. And we do that by looking at all these ecosystems you see listed there. And within those ecosystems, we have indicators. So Blueprint 2.0 is an indicator-driven approach to depict ecological integrity. Yet, right now, it does not explicitly incorporate urbanization or restoration potential. So my suggestion here is that we need some case studies to look at to really figure out what's going on with when we talk about restoration, when we talk about urbanization effects, of what's happening on the landscape. So today I'm going to be talking about longleaf pine savanna and pine woodlands in general. Pine savanna in the southeast currently occupies about 3 to 5% of its former range. It's a fire-dependent system, and does have many rare plants and animals that are dependent on wetlands, herbaceous understory, and this fundamental savanna structure you see there. And we do have the bulk majority of our southeastern landscape is fire suppressed, so we have very little of this savanna left. So for our pine ecosystem, we have 3 ecosystem-specific indicators. We have an amphibian index, we have open canopy and regularly burned areas, and we have the pine bird index, which is composed of northern bobwhite, a rugged woodpecker, and my focus today, the Bachman Sparrow. And among these, the Bachman Sparrow is kind of the medium. It's not quite the specialist that the red-cockaded woodpecker is, but it is rather particular. And the reason I really chose to look at a Bachman Sparrow more in depth is because it does make a really nice indicator. They can be very responsive to herbaceous understory and low basal areas that are indicative of savannas. They're also very sensitive to the amount of burning, so there has to be pretty frequent burning, as well as being sensitive to habitat fragmentation. So they really are a multi-scale indicator. And as I mentioned, that they can respond quickly to savanna changes, unlike RCWs or red-cockaded woodpeckers that need mature trees and proper cavities. These birds are more responsive to savanna structure. And they're also known to correlate with other species of concern. And then from the South Atlantic LCC perspective, what the Bachman Sparrow can do for us is give us insight into the effect of urbanization and provides an example of restoration potential. And then ultimately, we want to answer the question, are restoration and urban growth in conflict? And we're starting to get to this answer, but I'm not sure that we're there quite yet. So my objectives here today with you are to show you the quantitative species-habitat relationships, develop a species distribution model for Bachman Sparrow in North Carolina and beyond. This is an indicator that we're using for the South Atlantic LCC pine system throughout the range of the LCC, but our data is trained and validated on North Carolina-specific data, so that's what I'm going to show you today. And then we're going to use scenarios to identify the most efficient sites for restoration and determine the effect of projected urban growth on Bachman Sparrow. So we want to look at urbanization and restoration in particular. To do this, we used species distribution models. These are particular models that are very statistical. So some advantages are they're data-driven. You basically connect on-the-ground species data and calibrate it directly to spatial data. So there's no translation of literature experts involved with this. This is very data-driven, which does have weaknesses too, but it's one of my prime philosophies that I've done in research. Another advantage is that we can get new habitat relationships that were not previously known or recognized. And again, a model can be calibrated based on very quantitative habitat relationships. So I want to give you an overview of the modeling before I get into the nitty-gritty details here. So basically, we're taking on-the-ground bird data and combining it with environmental spatial data. And we're doing some statistics and coming up with a species distribution model. It actually starts as a probability, but we choose the best point where it discriminates presence and absence, or presence and pseudo-absence, and define habitat. And because we don't start out with a clear view of what is savanna habitat, we really have to define it first, and then we can look at fragmentation effects. So then we can look at we can calculate proportion of habitat within several radii and see if that has an effect. And then again, do some more stats and come up with a final species distribution model. And ultimately, we get to what are the urbanization effects and what are restoration scenarios. What does restoration scenarios look like? And I really emphasize statistics here because we're doing a little bit different than you might be used to with habitat suitability models. We're really using a statistical approach to look at probability of presence in this circumstance. So our presence data comes from several studies in North Carolina. The North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission provided 544 presence locations, including surveys and incidental observations. NC State, in a study with Paul Talley, Chris Moorman, and now Peucae, provided 99 presence locations, and then Jeff Walters headed a study from Virginia Tech at Camp Lejeune, and they provided 84 locations, and we're very grateful for everyone contributing field data to this project. So we had at least 4 methodologies within those three organizations that did surveys. and we had known heterogeneous detection, which was very problematic. So the solution there was to use presence-only modeling and avoid some of the problems with detectability. So with this, we use a resource selection function, which basically it looks at use versus availability, and uses in this case, we used a logistic regression. We used 60% of the data for training and 40% for validation. That was really just a nice balance that gave us plenty of validation points to look at. And that's a really important part of species distribution modeling, or any modeling, really. And then we had 727 presences, so we put out 727 pseudo-absences. And we did this within the extent of the survey data itself. And we also excluded urban developed and row crop agriculture because we already knew, just from common sense, that we weren't going to have Bachman sparrow in developed or row crop agriculture areas. We had several environmental variables. First one was actually a South Atlantic LCC indicator of regularly burned habitat, and this came from land fire data, which detects fires from really blackened areas by remote sensing. So we had a measure of fire from that. We used national land cover mean canopy cover data at two scales, one corresponding more to surveys, the 300 by 300 meters, and then one corresponding closely with home ranges at a 900 meter by 900 meter scale. So mean canopy cover, we had the standard deviation of canopy cover. We had evergreen land cover, again from national land cover data. We had row crop agriculture. We used a bigger scale for this at 3 kilometers because of another study that Paul Talley had led. And we wanted to get a better picture of landscape fragmentation. And then we looked at urbanization at the same scale. And then restoration scenarios. We looked at, we manipulated layers so that we had a canopy cover reduction of 30%. We had prescribed fire, a scenario where we've had prescribed fire everywhere except for urban and row crops. And then we have a combination of canopy cover reduction by 30% and prescribed fire. So we had 3 restoration scenarios. We had urban scenarios as well. We first looked at really looking at the urban-fire relationship and to see what was going on with that. And then we used loose data from Adam Taranto and Southeast Climate Science Center. And this was just published, but it has urban growth projections all the way up to 2090. That's what we used for this. And then we projected hectares of Bachman sparrow habitat by excluding urbanization. So basically accounted for that urbanization effect, if it's there, sparrows or not. And the big assumption of all the modeling you'll see here, as far as the future goes, is that we are assuming that current predicted Bachman sparrow distribution is sustained as habitat. So basically we're saying burned areas with appropriate canopy cover are going to remain that way into the future. And essentially, if there's burned data in the past 10 years, it's going to continue to be burned. So that's an important assumption. If you just look at the raw data here, used Bachman sparrow locations versus available, you can see on the y-axis here is the amount of fire. So you can see at the used locations, we had over 40% of those locations were depicted with fire disturbance. And I think it's about 13% of pseudo-absence locations had fire on them. So you can see the big gap just right away with that. And that was a variable in our model. Now let's look at some other habitat relationships. On these graphs, you'll see probability of presence on the y-axis, so presence of Bachman sparrow. And so obviously more is good. And then the x-axis, mean canopy cover in this case at the 300 meter scale. So that ranges from 0% canopy cover to 100%. You can see at a very local scale, you can see they prefer open areas from this local scale. This is one you might expect on the x-axis. This time is mean canopy cover at a broader scale at 900 meters. And you can see there we had the highest probability of Bachman sparrow, right around 55% canopy cover. And that's something we expected in the project. This one is a bit different. This is standard deviation of canopy cover. So in areas that are really homogeneous, they prefer these areas. And as you start getting more heterogeneity, more simple canopy gaps, or maybe small blocks of forest, they really decrease dramatically. And then finally, looking at agricultural row crops. This is in proportion on the x-axis. So you can see that there's pretty steady decline, but particularly after about 30% or 0.3, you really start getting a decline in Bachman Sparrow. And that we don't fully understand yet. It seems to be a fragmentation effect, but also it adds to some of the other data we have. And then this is a bit of a makeshift graph here, but it really just shows a statistical interaction with probability of presence and proportion of habitat within 1 kilometer. So on the right side, you see the axis probability of presence. This is from our initial model, but then we took proportion of habitat within 1 kilometer, and we saw an interaction. So we saw basically what happens is that even at a low probability, if you have a lot of neighboring areas that are habitat, you'll still get birds. So this happens especially a lot around the Fort Bragg and Sand Hills area of North Carolina, where it seemed to be that birds were kind of moving over to less quality habitat if the neighboring areas were good quality or good probability. All right, let's look at some results here. In purple, throughout the presentation here, you'll see Bachman Sparrow represented by purple. And those are the predicted areas, so predicted presence for Bachman Sparrow. This is the Holly Shelter, Camp Lejeune area. Overall, we were able to predict absences with 90% accuracy, and then we were able to predict presences with 87% accuracy. And we really captured that 87% in about 10% of the area. So what you can see here is when you overlay our GPS locations, you can see that the model did a very good job in this coastal area of really picking up those presences. And I can go back and forth a little bit here, but you can see how well that model picked up those locations. This one is a restoration scenario. So again, purple is predicted presence of Bachman Sparrow. And with the orange there, the slightly lighter color, is the predicted presence when you add fire to it. So we can see a lot of these areas start connecting together. And this is in the Green Swamp Preserve area. This map is, again, another scenario with 30% canopy cover reduction. And you can see, again, the purple is present location right now. So you can see there's much more potential restorable area with canopy cover reduction, but it does overlap quite a bit with the fire as well. And one thing I'll point out here is that we are using national land cover data combined with some state-level data of longleaf pine mapping. And so there are some errors in there. This one in particular has been pointed out to us in that there are areas in here that are actually, they're classified as forested wetlands, but they appear to be pine plantations and some pine forest mixed in with some other agricultural habitats. So that's something to keep in mind moving forward, that there's always some room for improvement here, but it is far and away using the best data layers that we have. So when you look at restoration scenarios combined with Blueprint 2.0, we initially see this. We started out with about 173,000 hectares predicted to be present. You can see that we come up with some pretty substantial amounts in our restoration scenarios. So prescribed burns, over 100,000 hectares available. Canopy cover reduction, much more, as you saw, over 400,000 hectares. And then we kind of get a synergistic effect with the prescribed burning plus canopy cover, and it goes up over 780,000 hectares. Now, in regard to the blueprint, you can see going across there, you see there's a pretty good amount in the highest priority high priority, and even the corridors have a pretty good amount. Given that corridors are 5% of the blueprint, they're taking about 9% of the restoration area. So that's a good thing to see. And I'll highlight overall our blueprint concentrates on that best 30%. So right now, in our predicted distribution, we have 63% falling in that high priority areas. About 35% of prescribed burning, 40% of canopy reduction, and 32% of the combined canopy cover reduction and prescribed burning. Keep in mind here, even with that 32%, with that last scenario, you're looking at 780,000 hectares. There's still a lot of hectares, a lot of land area within that. And I'll say the same thing for, if you do the simple math with prescribed burning, you come up with about 35,000 hectares of prescribed burning in the high priority classes of the blueprint. So the blueprint does a pretty good job of capturing those areas. Oops. And then let's look at significant geographic areas for a moment. These are our areas designated for longleaf pine savanna restoration. So I want to give you an idea of what's going on here. Currently, the predicted distribution is within, about 79% of the predicted distribution is within asignificant geographic areas. Most of that was in the primary SGA, as you can see there, 71%. And you see a pretty good pattern here. Again, pretty good acreage within significant geographic areas, about 56% of the prescribed bird scenario, 40% of the canopy cover scenario, and so on. And then something I think is really important here to recognize, this has been a bit surprising to see how much of the predicted distribution is in protected areas. We came up with only 47%, and I checked and double-checked this, and it's true because of a lot of small patches, and there's also a number of patches really west of in the Sandhills area, really, just off protected areas. And the important part here to realize is that with our restoration scenarios, we had very little of these areas were already protected. So you can think of that as good or bad. For one, it means that a lot of restoration will need to be done on private lands. Secondly, you could look at it and say, hey, we're doing a pretty good job on our protected lands because they're kind of near their maximum. So there's some to do on protected land, some restoration to do on protected lands, but not a lot.
Hey, Brad, can I jump in with a quick question?
Sure.
Someone was asking, what part of the canopy do these birds occupy, upper, mid, or lower?
That I cannot tell from the spatial data. So basically, you can view this as if you were looking down, like looking down at an aerial photo or satellite image in this case, and what is the percentage of canopy cover. So this is from satellite imagery that's been calibrated on the ground. And I encourage you to look at the National Land Cover data for this. It just came out this past year. It's really, really useful data. And I can tell you, just walking around like the green swamp area, it literally showed the open canopy path I was walking on. So it is pretty good data. But it doesn't distinguish depth of whether it's shrubbiness or not. All right, let's look at urban-fire relationships. This is a very intriguing question that came up. Where does fire suppression begin? Now, this is North Carolina data again. The x-axis is distance from urban. And this is defined by sleuth data, so it's defined on road density. On the y-axis, you see hectares of fire within distance classes. And so you can see when you're right on top of urbanized areas at the 0, you get very few fires, and that's a good thing, I would suspect. But you can see you really start getting more fires, until you get up to about 600 meters from urbanized area, and then it starts bouncing around. So this is an area we think, well, within 600 meters, it looks like there's some version of fire suppression going on. And this was important moving forward. And again, this is from the land fire data that we use for the modeling and sleuth urbanization data. And it really just shows that 600 meters was really important. So if we overlay the Bachman Sparrow with the urbanization data, you can see the result here. We have the prediction going through 2090, On the y-axis, you get very simplistic Bachman Sparrow hectares. So you can see the top line, dashed line there is with no buffer, assuming basically habitat has to be directly on urbanized areas to be affected. And the lower line there, the solid line with circles, is with the 600-meter buffer if we were to assume that fire is not going to happen within 600 meters of an urban area. So the main thing to take from this is that we have a large amount of the population is within 600 meters of an urban area right now. So you see the 2010 projection, that's basically the definition from the urbanization data. So we have a large population of Bachman Sparrow within 600 meters of urban areas that we think, at least the data provides some evidence that it could be fire suppressed. But otherwise, you see a very steady decline. And keep in mind, too, you see the scale there starts at 100,000 hectares. Over 80,000 is in protected land. So if you were to look at this as far as how much private land Bachman Sparrow habitat is out there, then you get a much steeper decline. It could be about 30–40% of the population. So let's look at this urban buffer effect just to give you a better idea. This is Fort Bragg in the Sand Hills game area, Bachman Sparrow. This is with, in black, you'll see the 2050 urbanization with no buffer. You can see how that overlaps some of the purple areas. Well, if you add the 600-meter buffer and assume birds are going to go away within that 600 meters of urban areas, it's a lot more. And it's just a function of the spatial configuration of the urbanization. So I can go back and forth one more time, but if we assume that fire suppression takes place within 600 meters, then that's a pretty large difference. So what does the future look like? Looking at these restoration scenarios, if we run the models again and include urban growth, here's what happens in the restoration scenario with prescribed burning. We go from 101,000 hectares to only 47, so really cut in half after we account for urban growth. Canopy cover reduction also has a substantial reduction. And then our combined prescribed burning and mean canopy cover reduction. This is a little more inclusive, of course. That's a lot of hectares in the first place. But again, it gets cut in nearly half when we account for urban growth. So overall, that's something we really need to consider where urban growth is happening. So this is something we're really just at the beginning of right now, and it needs some more work. But this is overlaying the Bachman Sparrow current distribution in purple with significant geographic areas. And the primary significant geographic areas that are designated for restoration are in the tighter dashes, the little more darker dashes. And you can see, if we look to 2050, use urban growth for that period, and use our fire plus canopy cover reduction scenario, here's what we get. So another filter that we may end up going through here is using these significant geographic areas to get a better idea of what's available for restoration. You'll notice the Uwharrie area to the west of Fort Bragg is a big part of available area. And that's really just the start of how we might prioritize this. So for some next steps, as I mentioned, we're clarifying some filters to really narrow down priority restoration areas. I showed you the urban growth. If you exclude urban growth areas, we could make it exclusive to significant geographic areas. We could use Blueprint 2.0, proximity to protected areas, patch size. There's a number of ways we could do this, and even looking at restoration scenarios to say, hey, fire alone, if that's all it needs, then that's should be done before doing a more complex management strategy. And then I think it'd be beneficial to look at some landscape metrics of patch size, area perimeter ratio, distance nearest patch. And then an important consideration here is, does the model work in other southeastern states? Generally, it shows pretty good patterns. You can pick out the Red Hills in Florida, for example, Florida and Georgia area. But we need more testing because this data is very specific to North Carolina, and there's been some thoughts that Bachman Sparrow are using different habitats in more southern states. And then an intriguing question here is there a relationship to replicated woodpecker habitat? This is interesting. I'll show you just one really zoomed-in picture here of, again, Bachman sparrow with replicated woodpecker, or RCW, locations on top of them. You can see it actually corresponds really quite well, and it makes sense given that RCWs are going to be more of a specialist than Bachman sparrow. And finally, I'll give you some take-home messages here. Using spatial data on fire and canopy cover, it directly addresses management issues in longleaf pine savanna. We can go much farther than just simply looking at land cover classification. A sizable portion of Bachman sparrow habitat is within 600 meters from urban areas right now. So we really don't know, are species declining due to fire suppression? Are these areas being maintained by general disturbance? Are other species at risk? So I think there's a lot of important questions with that. And that goes for now and in the future. And then finally, urban growth does seem to restrain pine savanna restoration potential, but it does seem that there is a lot of hectares out there, a lot of acres out there to do management on. So I think it's more of an idea here that more careful planning may minimize fragmentation. So I'd like to acknowledge again the co-authors on this overall project, funding provided by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in support of South Atlantic LCC, and once again our data sources and insights from these folks were really critical as well. With that, I'll take any questions, and I have my contact information there too if anything pops up later on.
Awesome, Brad. Thank you so much for that presentation. We've got plenty of time for questions, probably a good 15 minutes or so. So if anyone wants to jump in with questions, you can press *6 to unmute yourself, or you can type questions into the chat box.
So does anybody on the phone have the answer to the question about do we know what part of the canopy these birds are occupying? Because if we don't know that, then how do we know what treatments are actually contributing to improving their habitat?
I can chime in for a moment there. I think we're distinguishing pretty poor habitat from very different habitat. So I don't know that we're getting that specific. I think that fire-suppressed areas are coming up as more like blocks of forest habitat. So this is, I would draw the line at saying we can't tell you what management's needed. We could point you in the right direction that areas with particular canopy cover are related to the birds themselves.
This is Jeff Marcus on the phone, and in part in terms of that question of where the birds are using, they're really primarily tied to the ground. They nest on the ground and forage on the ground. So the connection to the canopy cover has more to do with allowing enough sunlight to the ground to get the herbaceous ground cover to grow. So that's the big key, is in terms of canopy and management, it's less important whether that's mid-story canopy or overstory canopy. Either one that negatively affects herbaceous ground cover, that's the real connection there.
Okay, that helps a lot. That I'm with you now. Okay, thank you very much for that explanation.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jeff. And I think that's a good point. In that, are we predicting Bachman sparrow? Are we predicting wiregrass? We don't have that data analysis at this point to see if we're really predicting the wiregrass and herbaceous understory.
Well, it seems like if you've got one, you got the other.
I don't know. There's potential for at least Bachman sparrow in wintertime, at least in Louisiana, to my knowledge, use a slightly different habitat, and that they'll use some boulder field kind of stuff and not be as picky as a breeding habitat. Other questions? And I'll say also that we're really polishing up models now and doing some last tweaks, so still a work in progress, but I think we're close to the finish line here.
No other questions for Brad? Virginia, did you put your hand up, or? Maybe not. I thought someone clicked their raise hand icon.
Yeah, I saw that too.
I lowered mine.
All right, well, hearing none, I guess we'll move on to some updates from other staff of the South Atlantic LCC. So I'm going to take back presenter power, Brad.
Thank you, Hillary.
And put my slides back up here. So first of all, I got some feedback recently that folks wanted some more advanced notice about the web forum topics that had been lined up. So I've put together a flyer that I'm going to keep up to date with the seasonal web forum schedule in 3-month chunks. So this is the fall edition. I'll still put the web forum on the South Atlantic LCC event calendar on our homepage and continue to send out the monthly reminder email about a week before, but this flyer will be on the website as well, so you'll have a little bit more notice about what web forums you might want to put on your calendar. And Rua also has a couple of quick updates about indicator revisions that he wanted to share. Rua?
Yeah, sure. And Hillary, you know you're not sharing anything on the WebEx, right? Hello? There we go. Okay, so wanted to give you a quick update on some of the indicator revisions. So folks that were in blueprint workshops and have been involved in the indicator process, you remember we're targeting a few specific ecosystems that needed the most help. And so a couple that are on the way basically for the next till the end of the year. And so our marine team is going to be meeting, marine revision team is going to be meeting to talk about some improved mammal models coming out of Duke, and that's going to be beginning of next month. So this is going to be pretty exciting, really impressive models and a way to build consistency with some of the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic marine spatial planning efforts up there. So the marine team is moving, and fairly soon, for those of you on the freshwater aquatic side, we're going to be sending out some emails and getting that team up and scheduled fairly soon as well. So we're also hoping to take on a few other things related to connectivity and a few other systems over the course of the year. So just a quick update on the revision process. So that's going to be basically, we're going to finish all the revisions by the end of this year, including revised updates to the Bachman Sparrow model that Brad just talked about. And then we'll start in on Blueprint 2.1, which is going to be a smaller, more data-driven update to Blueprint 2. So essentially just using some of the improved indicators and methods to make a small update to the overall blueprint.
Great, Rua, thanks. We got a chat from Bridget about a potential question. *6 to unmute your line if you want to jump in, Bridget.
Yeah, this is Bridget Costanzo. I'm with NRCS with the Working Lands for Wildlife program. And I just wanted to ask, I had seen a presentation a few years ago, and I'm afraid I don't remember who had given that, but I want to say it was someone in Alabama that was doing longleaf pine modeling. And they also had indicated that it was very important to plan at the landscape scale to do longleaf pine restoration. I don't remember the distances they had projected, but farther from urban areas. And I'm wondering if we're at a point where people feel that this is something that we can now kind of assume and that we should be incorporating into all of our longleaf pine habitat management when we're doing restoration, that we need to be cognizant of the distance to projected high-risk areas for urbanization, and maybe whether that's already going on, which I wouldn't be aware of.
I can just say personally, just looking at how much of an effect that buffer had, I was really surprised to see the big picture and look at a broad scale, and see how much that kind of a spread urbanization really makes a big effect. If that buffer is a real buffer that's stopping places from being burned and managed, it takes up a lot more area than I would have expected.
Yeah, it seems to be, and I know Jeff and other folks on the phone can speak to the challenges of trying to balance that, the sort of good habitat versus future urban growth and ability to burn. And there are some places people are able to burn near urban areas, but definitely hear lots of discussions about, working a lot with the urban communities for smoke easements, and it's really a big challenge, and it's one of the big central, I think, longleaf challenges, especially because there's a lot of great cores around major military bases, and there's also a lot of major urban growth around some of our major military bases. So it's kind of a huge challenge right now, figuring out what to do about it.
Thanks for that question, Bridget. Anybody else want to jump in while we're paused here? All right, well, thanks for the indicator revision update, Rua, and for letting me know. I was not sharing. I'm going to back up one slide just so you guys can see the flyer. So if you're curious about the upcoming web forums, we're going to have Christy Ilo next month and Tom Allen in November. So skipping ahead, a little more detail on Christy's upcoming presentation next month. This is going to take place October 15th, same time, same place. Christy Ilo is a research associate with the South Atlantic LCC and a policy associate with the Duke Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions. So Christy really serves as a liaison between the staff of the South Atlantic LCC and this team at Duke that's working to model how the impacts of potential management actions might be reflected in the cooperative's ecosystem indicators, that you heard a good bit about today from Brad. So she'll be talking about her project next month, which is looking at using geospatial tools to quantify answers to questions like the ones we've been talking about today. How does prescribed burning impact the pine and prairie ecosystem indicators, or how will acquiring a piece of land impact the South Atlantic LCC indicators? So these tools will hopefully help determine management actions that make the greatest contribution to your cooperative's long-term goals, namely protecting natural and cultural resources. And I always like to wrap up just reminding folks how they can get involved in your cooperative. So you can always contact staff or your steering committee rep directly. We also post frequent updates and events on the website where you can learn about upcoming projects or access spatial data and the conservation blueprint, of course. I really encourage anyone who's interested to join our web community. You'll get access to our monthly newsletter, which is a great summary of conservation news and updates on your cooperative's activities, as well as a monthly reminder about this web forum. So with that, I'll open the floor for any additional questions folks might have before we sign off. Just hit *6 to unmute. All right, well, it's 10:45, so we're ending a little early today, but that's it from the staff of the South Atlantic. So thank you so much, Brad, for presenting, and everyone for attending, and hope to see you next month.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone.